All right, so if we take a look at the map, here is what we've already discussed. First Battle of Bull Run, Fort Sumter, First Battle of Bull Run, Second Battle of Bull Run, Peninsula Campaign, Shenandoah Valley Campaign, Battle of Antietam, Battle of Chancellorsville, Battle of Gettysburg, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Fall of Memphis, Battle of Shiloh, Fall of Nashville, Fall of New Orleans, Fall of Vicksburg. We have any questions out there? All right. So, problems with the draft. Both sides did not like the draft. If you were wealthy, you could buy your way out of the draft in both the Union and the Confederacy. If you were in the Confederacy and you owned 20 or more slaves, you could be exempt. If you were a teacher, if you were a pharmacist, you could be exempt. There are a lot of ways to be exempt. If you were in college in the North, you could be exempt. So it's kind of hard to believe that at the same time that Gettysburg and the draft riots are going on in New York City, where Irish and African Americans are sort of the targets of this draft riot because of their competition for jobs. Young men are preparing to return back to school at Harvard and Yale. The Harvard-Yale regatta still continued to be they still followed through with the regatta during the war. So things looked very different in the North and the South, and the draft really made it feel like it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Do keep in mind there's a group known as the Peace Democrats. They're led by a guy named Clement Vallandigham. Vallandigham was what became known as a Copperhead. The Peace Democrats wanted the Confederacy to be their own country. So what they would wear is in their lapels, they would wear these copper pennies. Now, when we think about a penny, we think about what person on the penny? Lincoln, right? But then it was the head of Lady Liberty, Columbia. So they would wear these copperheads, but they got the name Copperhead sort of a double meaning, not only because of the copper pennies they wore on the lapels, but also because they were venomous and disastrous for the Union. Again, another tragic part of the New York City draft riots, not only the violence being the violence against Irish and especially African Americans during this riot was brutal, but the people that actually had to put down the riot itself were the guys who had fought at Gettysburg. They had to march from Gettysburg to put down the draft riots. Do keep in mind, Lincoln will win re-election. In 1864, he defeated Democratic candidate George B. McClellan, who had lost his command following the Union victory at Antietam. All right, hang in there with me, guys. Hang in there. Thanks. All right, here we have Vallandigham on the left. This is one of my favorite cartoons from the Civil War era. It shows the Copperheads who are like a planter class along the Ohio River and Lady Liberty trying to defend herself. There's also a lack of unity in the South, infighting in Lincoln or Davis's cabinet. Congressional re-elections were a problem for Jefferson Davis. Commissary was a huge problem for the Confederacy, meaning that soldiers and civilians were starving while the commissary wasn't getting the food out to soldiers in the community. It actually led to bread riots in Atlanta, Macon, and Augusta, Georgia. Probably the largest of all the bread riots. It was like sort of French Revolution-esque was the Richmond bread riots, where women not only raided bakeries but also jewelry stores and other shops to try to provide for their families. There's also high rates of desertion. Like in Floyd County, the Sissons gang it's kind of like Free State of Jones, that you guys have probably heard of. Free State of Jones Sisson these like groups of deserters in the South, they were a real deal thing. And like in Floyd County, the desertion rate got up to like 23%. There's also, after Vicksburg, Confederates like Vice President Alexander Stephens and others are pushing for peace. They want to bring about an end to the war. And so begins sort of this idea of the lost cause moving forward. Here we have sketches from the Richmond Red Riots on April 2nd, 1863. All right, final sketch of the war. Following the Union victory in the Chattanooga campaign and the Union's failed attempt to pursue Lee after Gettysburg, Grant is moved to the east, and he'll gain command in the east and command of all armies in the east and west. And in the west, his right-hand man, William T. Sherman, will gain command of Grant's army, the Army of the Cumberland, and so will begin the march to Atlanta, the siege of Atlanta, the march from Atlanta to Savannah. Atlanta will be burnt to the ground. The march from Savannah to Columbia, South Carolina, and the march from Columbia to Bentonville, North Carolina, outside of Raleigh-Durham. Each one of these places in the entire march there is going to be total destruction. Grant will do the same in his overland campaign and the siege of Petersburg, and Philip Sheridan will use the same tactics in the Shenandoah Valley in 1864. Union lines were basically cutting off all food and supply coming in and out of Richmond, in and out of Petersburg. Finally, on April 1st, 1865, the line is broken at Petersburg, and Lee's army begins to retreat toward Appomattox. He's trying to link up with Joseph E. Johnston's army, but he's going to be surrounded by the time he gets to Appomattox. And on April 9th, 1865, Lee will surrender to Grant in Wilbur McLean's parlor room at Appomattox Courthouse. Just a couple weeks later, Joseph E. Johnston will surrender to William T. Sherman outside of Bentonville. And then there'll be a few other commanders that will surrender later on that are fighting in different theaters of the war. So here we have William T. Sherman on the left. So we've got Chattanooga, march to Atlanta, march to the sea, Savannah, total destruction, scorched earth. Anything that could be destroyed was. They took railroad ties, and they would heat them up and bend them around trees. They called them Sherman neckties. Yeah. There was a little bit of fighting down there, but there weren't any like major battles. Most of the battles in Florida were coastal battles, but there was some skirmishing down there. There was one battle that created stir earlier on in the war for Fort Pickens. It was a coastal fort, but it's a good question. So this is Sherman's march here. And then we have the siege of Petersburg and Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. So some general effects of the war. It is the Brothers' War in the border states like West Virginia, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri. Families are pitted against each other. A lot of these guys that were commanders were best friends, and they were they've gone to West Point together. They had served in the Mexican War together, and now they're fighting against one another. One example of that would be the Terrell brothers. There were two brothers from Hot Springs, Virginia, that they fought on both sides. One went to West Point, one went to VMI. Southern troops became increasingly younger, meaning they were putting younger troops in. In the Battle of Newmarket on May 15, 1864, the soldiers were your age, average age of 16, 17 years old. The South was devastated at the end of the war. Major cities like Atlanta and Richmond were burned to the ground by the end of the war. Disease was the major killer. Nearly 620,000 men died in the war, and 416,000 of those deaths were due to disease and malnutrition. And really, you've got some brutal man-to-man, hand-to-hand combat. Top left here, we've got Atlanta. Bottom right, we've got Richmond. Top right, we have Carver Hospital in D.C. Bottom left, we've got cadets from VMI that fought in the war. This is Frank Atwill on the right. This is a doctor that wrote to his parents. Frank Atwill and 9 other VMI cadets that were your age, they died during this, as a result of this battle. 6 of the 10 are buried at VMI. Cadet Frank Atwill was struck in the calf of the leg. His wound was considered severe, though not dangerous. Being removed to Stanton, he had almost gotten well when he was attacked with lockjaw and died in the most excruciating agony. His pain was so intense that he could not touch the bed without a groan of agony, and death came to him as a blessed relief. Dr. F.T. Stribling, July 20th, 1864. Some of the other general effects of the war: a lot of wartime diaries and letters sent home that not only tells the history of the war, it also tells the harsh reality of the war. Homes and land in the South were destroyed. Both soldiers on both sides suffered permanent disabilities, from anywhere from PTSD to amputated limbs. Confederate money was absolutely worthless at the end of the war. Huge numbers of prisoners of war on both sides. Andersonville was the worst of all the prison camps. 45,000 Union prisoners held there. They didn't even have the capacity to hold 20,000. Nearly 13,000 died. Captain Henry Wirtz was one of the only Confederates tried and executed for war crimes. This is what Andersonville looked like. Union had some really rough prisons too. Elmira, New York, they called Helmira. Women are tremendously important in the war. The women in the North and the South, they keep businesses running, farms, plantations, factories, homes. They keep children alive. They kept detailed diaries. One of the most detailed of the war was Mary Chestnut's diary. She was a Southern woman. They served as nurses, spies. Clara Barton was the Union nurse and founder of the American Red Cross. Notable spies: Rose O'Neal Greenhow in D.C., Belle Boyd in the Shenandoah Valley, Elizabeth Van Lew, U.S. Union spy in Richmond. Some women also secretly served as soldiers, like Frances Clayton served under the name Jack Williams. And again, women were willing to fight to be able to survive this war. So on the top left, Frances Clayton. Top center, Clara Barton. Top right, Elizabeth Van Lew. This is Rose O'Neal Greenhow and her daughter. This is Mary Chestnut. And then that's Belle Boyd, a.k.a. the Cleopatra of the Confederacy. African Americans play a tremendously important role in the war. They serve on the side of the Confederacy and the Union. For the Confederate side, it was probably like somewhere around like 5,000 soldiers. On the Union side, it was almost 400,000 that served in the military and in the Navy. The largest African-American regiment, and the first one that got started, was the 54th Massachusetts. Has anyone ever heard of the film Glory before? Okay, it's based on the 54th. They won the Battle of James Island, but led the charge and were defeated at Fort Wagner outside South Carolina. They were led by Robert Gould Shaw. Robert Smalls, sailor, Navy captain, first African American to become a naval captain. He actually stole a Confederate ship during the war, and he goes on to become one of the first African American congressmen after the war. So here we have, this is pretty rare. These are two African Americans that served on the Confederate side. Here we have Robert Smalls, Robert Gould Shaw. We've got a broadside poster for recruiting the 54th. This is the member of the 54th Massachusetts. Look, he's got sergeant stripes. That's a pretty big deal. And then this is a broadside poster recruiting people to join the Navy. With malice toward none and charity for all, that was the immortal words of Abraham Lincoln in his second inaugural address. We're just a little over a month away from the end of the war. When Lincoln's reelected, he wants to bring the country back together with malice toward none, or hatred toward none, with charity for all. We must bind up the nation's wounds, bring everybody back together, and start the process of Reconstruction. But just 5 days after Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox, Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater watching the play Our American Cousin. This is going to lead us into the era of Reconstruction, but obviously Lincoln is not going to be able to be a part of that. So I've got a map for you so you understand. We've got the Overland Campaign from the Wilderness to Spotsylvania, North Anna, Cold Harbor, the Siege of Petersburg here, Richmond's over here, and then we've got the final engagements, Amelia Springs, Sailor's Creek, and Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. This is Wilbur McLean's house where the surrender took place, right here in this parlor room. This is another interesting Civil War anecdote. Wilbur McLean lived in Manassas at the start of the war. He moved because obviously the fighting was happening right outside of his home, and McLean will famously say, "The war started in my front yard and ended in my front parlor room." And here we have Lee surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, or at the McLean House at Appomattox Courthouse. And then finally, we have the broadside poster, Ford's Theater, 10th Street, Friday evening, April 14th, this evening. The performance will be honored by the presence of President Lincoln. Benefit. And then we've got John Wilkes Booth, Confederate sympathizer. He sneaks in, shoots Lincoln, jumps off the balcony, and yells Virginia's motto, Sic Semper Tyrannis, thus always to tyrants. He'll later be captured, surrounded, and killed by bounty hunters.